The cartel enforcers assumed they'd find an easy score, maybe a sleepy caretaker at a secluded farmhouse and a pile of Hollywood riches. It never crossed their minds that the man feeding horses in the early morning light was Keanu Reeves, or that he was prepared to fight for his life and his land. Under a wide California sky, rolling hills and winding dirt roads gave way to a simple, unassuming property: Keanu Reeves's farm. It wasn't the sprawling, high-tech compound one might imagine a famous actor owning. Rather, it consisted of a single-story farmhouse, a weathered barn with peeling red paint, a few stable bays for horses, and acres of pasture edged by old wooden fences. For years, Keanu had sought out anonymity and peace in this rural pocket of the state. In town, people quickly got used to seeing him in worn jeans, picking up bales of hay, or casually sipping coffee at the local diner. He never flaunted wealth. If anyone recognized him from his blockbuster films, they gave him the courtesy of privacy, offering a friendly wave instead of a selfie request. Over time, he established a reputation as a generous neighbor who donated quietly to community projects and volunteered for local events, anything that let him be just another person enjoying country life. Rumors in the underworld. Yet miles to the south, beyond fields and scenic drives, a violent rumor began circulating among a local Mexican cartel cell. Word spread of a film star's farm that supposedly housed hidden riches, antique props, expensive memorabilia, maybe even cash from movie deals. Nobody in the cartel had confirmed the rumor. They'd only heard chatter about a famous actor living unprotected on a quiet ranch. Real or not, the story piqued interest. The cell's leader, a man named El Ogro, decided it was worth a shot. He instructed one of his mid-level lieutenants, Victor Alvarez, to assemble a team, raid the farm, and seize whatever valuables they could find. A kidnapping was also on the table if the occupant seemed like a good ransom target. A misdirected scout. To gather intel, the cartel sent a scout posing as a wandering farmhand. The man introduced himself at the gate, claiming he was broke and desperate for work. Keanu, stepping outside in dusty boots, politely explained he ran the farm alone. The scout peered around, trying to spot security cameras or guard dogs. He saw none, just some horses, a small chicken coop, and an old pickup. Keanu, soft-spoken and unguarded, didn't reveal any suspicion. After a brief chat, the scout left, convinced they'd found a surefire target. He reported back that there were no armed guards, no elaborate alarms, and no sign of anyone else besides Reeves himself. What the scout didn't realize was that Keanu's calm disposition masked years of martial arts training. The actor had not only studied choreography for film roles, but had also worked closely with experts in tactical shooting, hand-to-hand combat, and situational awareness. For the big screen, sure, but he embraced the training with the same diligence he brought to every role. There was no off switch for the proficiency he'd gained, no way to unlearn reflexes honed by tireless practice. A peaceful evening. A week or so later, on a night thick with summer warmth, Keanu stood on his porch, sipping tea and admiring the sunset. The sky glowed in shades of orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the grass. All around lay the hush of farmland settling down for the night. Horses whinnying, trees rustling in a faint breeze, and an occasional dog bark echoing from a distant property. He'd been reading earlier, an old paperback borrowed from the local library, but the early evening light was too pretty to ignore, so he came outside to enjoy it. In a few days, he'd drive to Los Angeles for post-production work on his latest film. But for now, he wanted to soak up the quiet that anchored him to the real world. He had no idea that, miles away, two SUVs rumbled up a back road, loaded with weapons and men who believed they were about to make an effortless fortune. Intruders on the road. Those men, led by Victor Alvarez, moved under the cover of dusk. They killed the headlights halfway down the rural highway, relying on the faint glow of the moon to keep them on track. Each enforcer in Alvarez's crew checked his weapons, a small arsenal that included handguns, semi-automatic rifles, and blades. Their plan was brutally simple. Park at the end of the farm's dirt road, spread out, neutralize any occupant, gather valuables, and disappear. If the occupant resisted, they'd show no mercy. Alvarez, staring at a map illuminated by a red-tinted flashlight, muttered instructions in Spanish. He'd run similar raids before, but never on a celebrity's property. He anticipated a bodyguard or two, nothing his men couldn't handle. Secretly, he dreamed of returning to El Ogro with proof that their daring robbery of a Hollywood star had succeeded. That kind of coup would boost his standing in the cartel. A subtle disquiet. At Keanu's farm, the horses became restless, neighing in short, anxious bursts. Keanu paused, lowering his mug of tea. Animals often sensed intruders, be they coyotes, snakes, or wandering people, before humans picked up on anything. Moving inside, he flicked off the farmhouse lights to get a better look outside without reflection. The gravel driveway leading to his porch was empty. The yard was quiet except for the animals' uneasy shuffling, but Keanu felt a prickling at the back of his neck, a hint that something was off. He set his mug on the kitchen table and reached for a flashlight. The interior of the farmhouse was simple: old wooden floors, a single worn rug, a couch, and a shelf lined with paperback novels and mementos from film sets. Nothing ostentatious. Stepping onto the porch, he strained his ears. Then came the faint crunch of tires rolling over dirt. Too soft for a random traveler. Too stealthy for a local dropping by. Fear fluttered in his gut, tempered by trained composure. He quietly walked back inside, turned off the porch light, and waited. The cartel advances. Some distance from the house, two SUVs parked behind a copse of trees. Alvarez's men spilled out, black silhouettes against the moonlit sky. The group split into smaller units, each assigned a direction of approach. A couple of them peeled off to guard the perimeter and keep the vehicles ready for a fast escape. Alvarez signaled to one of his men, a wiry figure holding a large flashlight fitted with a red filter. That man took point. They crept along the fence bordering the property, weapons at the ready. If all went well, they'd be in and out before anyone in the nearby town realized something was amiss. But nothing about this place was exactly as it seemed. First clashes. Inside the barn, one of the men pried the door open. He expected to find a quiet storage space, or maybe a caretaker's quarters. Instead, he stepped onto hay-strewn flooring and shone his flashlight in a wide arc. Two horses stood in stalls, whinnying in alarm. Then came a shadow of movement from behind a stack of bales. Keanu emerged, startling the intruder with swift silence. The intruder managed a half-yell, raising his pistol. But Keanu seized the man's arm, forced it skyward, and drove an elbow into his gut. Winded, the intruder stumbled. Before he could recover, Keanu disarmed him, sending the gun clattering onto the barn floor. A single punch to the side of his head dropped him. Another man, hearing the commotion, rushed in. He saw his comrade collapsed and aimed his rifle. But Keanu feinted left and grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the wall. With a fluid pivot, he knocked the rifle's barrel aside. The intruder fired a wild shot into the rafters, wood splintering overhead. Moving in close, Keanu slammed the pitchfork handle into the man's midsection. The intruder crumpled, gasping. In less than a minute, two men were down. Outside the barn, a third raider overheard the struggle and shouted a warning in Spanish. The night erupted in frantic movement as others realized their target wasn't a sleepy caretaker, but a formidable opponent. Alvarez's shock. Closer to the main house, Alvarez and another group of men had begun forcing the front door. The lock gave way under a few solid kicks. They barged in, guns raised, flashlights sweeping across the modest living room. They expected someone cowering behind furniture, but the space was empty. A single lamp glowed near the couch, illuminating a photo of Keanu with a film crew. The men stared at the picture, half in disbelief. Yes, it was definitely that actor. Alvarez smirked, calling out in a loud voice, "We know you're here, Reeves. Show yourself." Silence answered. He directed two men to search the bedroom and a small side room. They found them empty. Bed neatly made, clothes hung in a plain closet. There was no sign of panicked flight. The men regrouped. "He must be outside," Alvarez muttered, turning to see if they could spot him through the windows. In the distance came the crack of a gunshot, likely the rifle discharging inside the barn. Alvarez's eyes narrowed. This was supposed to be straightforward, yet now it sounded like a fight. The farmhouse ambush. Leaving a man posted by the door, Alvarez pushed through the living room toward the back porch. Another intruder tried a side window. He slipped outside, patrolling the perimeter. That's when Keanu struck. He'd circled around the barn to the rear of the house, anticipating a pincer move. Sighting the side window intruder first, he advanced soundlessly, stepping across a patch of grass. The intruder, shining a flashlight across the yard, felt a presence behind him a second too late. Keanu locked an arm around his neck. In a swift jiu-jitsu move, he dragged the struggling man down, deprived him of air, and secured the weapon. The flashlight dropped, rolling across the yard, its beam dancing over the dirt. The captive let out a choked groan, then went limp. Breathing hard, Keanu picked up the flashlight and turned it off. He peered into the farmhouse where Alvarez paced, shouting orders in Spanish. Another man emerged from the back door, gun raised. Keanu ducked behind a wooden rain barrel. The intruder scanned the darkness, cursing under his breath. Alerting a neighbor. By chance, a nearby neighbor, Mary, had seen or heard something suspicious. Her dogs wouldn't stop barking, facing Keanu's property. She peered through binoculars and noticed faint lights darting across the farmland, as if multiple flashlights were in use. Worried, she dialed the local sheriff's department. "It might be nothing," she said, "but it looks like trespassers are creeping around Keanu Reeves's place." The dispatcher took Mary's concern seriously. It wasn't every day that a call came in about suspicious activity at a celebrity's farm. Within minutes, a patrol car was en route, with backup preparing to follow. Battle in the night. Back at the farmhouse, Alvarez fumed. He'd lost contact with half his men. Two more stepped onto the back porch, scanning the yard. Keanu, crouched in the shadows, weighed his options. He had a captured pistol now, but using it meant risking a shootout. He preferred close quarters, where he could neutralize them without lethal force if possible. A twig snapped under an intruder's boot, giving away their position. Keanu lunged from behind the rain barrel, catching the first man off balance. He smacked the side of the man's head with the butt of the pistol, sending him sprawling. The second intruder fired off two panicked shots. One bullet splintered the porch railing, the other whizzed past Keanu's shoulder. Keanu threw himself into a forward roll, then sprang up to drive an open palm strike into the shooter's sternum. The intruder hit the ground, groaning in pain. Alvarez confronts Keanu. Hearing the shots ring out, Alvarez dashed onto the back porch. Flashlight in one hand, handgun in the other, he locked eyes with Keanu. Recognition flashed. This was no mere caretaker or frightened civilian. This was a man who knew exactly how to fight. "You're quite the fighter, Reeves," Alvarez sneered, aiming his gun. "But you're one man, and I have a whole crew." Keanu, chest heaving, aimed the captured pistol at Alvarez. "Your crew's not looking so good." Alvarez snarled something in Spanish. He fired, forcing Keanu to dive behind a beam supporting the porch roof. Sparks flew as bullets struck wood. Keanu returned fire, aiming low to avoid a lethal shot, but the bullet whizzed past Alvarez's feet. The cartel leader took cover behind a heavy metal trough. For several tense seconds, they traded gunshots, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness. Alvarez realized, with mounting dread, that half his men were nowhere to be seen, and not because they'd fled. They were probably incapacitated by this single occupant. The sheriff arrives. Suddenly, distant sirens pierce the night, growing louder with each passing second. Alvarez's face twisted in rage. "You called the cops?" he shouted. Keanu didn't answer, but they both knew the farm's isolation meant a swift response was unlikely, unless a neighbor had alerted them early. Clearly, that's what had happened. Red and blue lights flickered against the distant trees. Alvarez weighed his options. Abandoning the raid meant leaving men behind. Staying meant a showdown with law enforcement. "All right," he hissed at two remaining enforcers who crept out from the side yard. "We grab what we can and retreat." A desperate escape. While Alvarez's men tried to gather their wounded comrades, Keanu saw a chance to drive them off completely. He advanced across the yard, moving from cover to cover, forcing them to retreat farther toward their SUVs. One of them fired wildly, but panic and the swirling beams of flashlights made his aim erratic. The sheriff's patrol car screeched to a stop near the property's entrance, headlights illuminating the road. Officers exited with weapons drawn. Alvarez cursed and sprinted for the SUV, motioning a handful of his men to follow. Others lay groaning in the grass or unconscious in the barn. Shots echoed, some from the sheriff's side, some from the disorganized cartel men. Dust kicked up as an SUV peeled away, headlights flaring. In the commotion, Keanu tackled one last intruder who was hobbling toward the second SUV. With a grunt, he disarmed the man, pinned him, and glanced up in time to see Alvarez's vehicle vanish in a cloud of dust. The sheriff's deputies rushed forward, shining flashlights on the battered criminals scattered around the yard, securing the scene. A deputy confronted Keanu, recognizing the actor. "Mr. Reeves, are you injured?" Keanu, adrenaline still pounding, shook his head. "Just bruises. Some of them need medical attention, though." Spotting the unconscious men, the deputies moved in with caution, placing them in handcuffs where possible. Sirens heralded additional units. Soon, the yard glowed with strobing lights, the air thick with the reek of gunpowder and kicked-up dirt. Radio chatter crackled. Paramedics rushed to treat the wounded, and an astonished Sheriff Ballard arrived, taking everything in with wide eyes. Aftermath in the dawn. By the time dawn broke, the last of the raiders had been rounded up or fled. Alvarez himself had escaped, but the majority of his crew was either injured or in custody. Bullet casings littered the ground. Sections of the farmhouse showed splintered wood and shattered windows. The barn's door hung crooked on its hinges from the initial forced entry. An exhausted Keanu leaned against a fence post, answering the sheriff's questions. "I didn't call 911, he admitted, wincing as he gingerly touched a bruise on his arm. "My neighbor must have heard something. Thank goodness she did." Ballard exhaled. "We've seen attempted burglaries, but not a full-scale armed raid like this. Seems they were after more than your wallet." He surveyed the unconscious men being loaded into ambulances. I guess they thought you'd have a treasure trove. Keanu's gaze drifted across his wounded farm. This place isn't worth what they imagined. I keep it simple. The sheriff nodded, respectful. You saved a lot of people from harm, Mr. Reeves, yourself included. We'll need an official statement. Then we'll figure out how many of these guys face charges. A couple might not make it if their injuries are too severe. Keanu frowned, not relishing the idea of anyone dying. He'd done what he had to, but he hadn't aimed to kill. Do what you have to, Sheriff, he said quietly. Word spreads. Once the immediate crisis subsided, the media found out. A farm belonging to Keanu Reeves had been attacked by heavily armed criminals, resulting in multiple arrests and injuries. Helicopters circled overhead for aerial footage. Journalists raced to the area, hoping for a sensational story about a beloved star repelling cartel raiders. Sheriff's deputies blocked them at the farm's entrance, granting Keanu space to collect himself. Neighbors trickled over, worried and curious. They saw the bullet holes in the barn, the battered door, and the scuff marks in the yard. Many expressed relief that no one else was caught in the crossfire. One older man clapped Keanu on the shoulder. Heard you gave them a real taste of their own medicine, he said with a hint of pride. Keanu just shook his head, humility overshadowing any pride. I did what anyone would do if they had the training. Retreat and recovery. Hank, a local handyman, soon arrived with a promise to start repairs. He shook his head in disbelief at the sight of broken windows and pockmarked siding. Never thought I'd see something like this here, he muttered. Keanu assisted him, helping board up holes in the barn and farmhouse so the place wouldn't be exposed overnight. Throughout the day, detectives gathered evidence, taking photos of the damage. Broken furniture, scattered bullets, and traces of blood stained the interior floors. Each item told a piece of the night's story. Keanu cooperated, calmly describing how he'd moved from barn to yard to house, neutralizing armed men one after another. The officers listening were stunned. Some recognized the skill required for such precision under pressure. A quiet evening with unsettling thoughts. When the sun set again, the farm was strangely silent. No flashing lights, no frantic voices, just the residual tension in the air. Keanu, exhausted, made a modest dinner, then slumped into an armchair, one of the few pieces of furniture left intact. Sleep wouldn't come easy. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard the crunch of gravel under boots or saw the muzzle flash in the dark. He felt torn. Part of him wanted to fortify the place, add an alarm system, maybe even hire private security. Another part insisted that doing so would erode everything he loved about living here: the simplicity, the trust. He refused to let fear dictate his life. But he also acknowledged that the cartel's leader was still out there, possibly plotting revenge. The cartel's anger. In a cramped motel room an hour away, Alvarez nursed a bruised rib. One of his men was treating a bloody gash on his forearm. Anger simmered in Alvarez's eyes. He'd lost face. More than half his crew lay in county jail or in hospital beds with deputy guards outside. The easy loot they expected? Non-existent. Instead, they'd run into an actor with better fighting skills than most professional bodyguards. He hated the idea of returning to El Ogro empty-handed, confessing that the operation ended in a fiasco. "We'll regroup," Alvarez spat in Spanish, glaring at his remaining associates. "We'll get him another time. We'll do it bigger and smarter." His men, some trembling with fear, others seething with hatred, nodded. For now, they had to keep their heads low. The sheriff's department would be on alert. But eventually, Alvarez promised himself, the debt would be repaid. Local aftermath. Meanwhile, the town was abuzz with talk of the raid. The local diner filled with chatter about how Keanu Reeves had single-handedly warded off a dozen cartel men. Though details were scarce, rumors became more dramatic with each telling, some claiming he fought them with kung fu moves from his own movies, others swearing he had a secret arsenal in the barn. Keanu mostly avoided the rumor mill. When he ventured into town for groceries, neighbors bombarded him with thanks and anxious questions. He answered politely, though he kept a low profile. If anyone had illusions about him being superhuman, he set them straight. "I'm just glad no innocent bystanders were hurt," he'd say, deflecting praise. A worrying note. About a week later, the sheriff informed Keanu that some of Alvarez's men were uncooperative during interrogation. Others hinted the cartel might retaliate. "We can't confirm anything, but be cautious," Sheriff Ballard advised, handing him a slip of paper with the contact info of a local security consultant. That same evening, Keanu found a note in his mailbox. No return address. "We're watching. This isn't finished." He stood at the end of his driveway, the note trembling in his hand. Whether it was a prank or a genuine threat, it stoked anxiety. He reported it to the authorities, who suspected a cartel warning. Neighbors urged Keanu to consider leaving, at least until the cartel threat passed. A few older folks remembered stories of criminals who kept grudges, but Keanu felt torn. The reason he chose this farm was to live outside the frenzy of Hollywood. Wouldn't fleeing mean letting fear chase him away from his own sanctuary? Stepping up security. Despite his reluctance, he took steps to secure the farm. He replaced doors with sturdier ones, installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter, and consulted with a local security company about cameras. He adopted a large German shepherd named Ranger, a retired service dog with protective instincts. The dog patrolled the yard at night, sniffing around fences and stables. Each measure felt necessary, yet it chipped away at the solitude he once treasured. Keanu reminded himself that survival came first. In quiet moments, he replayed the fight in his mind. The adrenaline rush, the swift, disarming moves, the desperate measure of returning gunfire. He'd never asked for violence to find him here, but it had, and it might again. An unexpected ally. Late one afternoon, as Keanu loaded supplies into his pickup truck at the hardware store, he noticed a sleek black sedan parked across the lot. Its driver seemed to watch him. Suspicion flared. He drove off, taking an indirect route back home. The sedan followed at a distance. Eventually, he pulled over under a big oak tree, hopped out, and waited, heart pounding. The sedan eased up behind him. A man in a suit emerged, hands raised in a show of peace. "Mr. Reeves, I'm David Park," he said. "I'm a private investigator, hired by a friend of yours in L.A. They're worried about your safety." Keanu exhaled, relief mingling with annoyance at being tailed. Park explained he was there to keep watch from a distance, just in case the cartel returned. "I'm sorry if I spooked you," he said, handing over a business card. Your friend asked for total discretion. Though uneasy, Keanu accepted the card. Maybe having an extra set of eyes wasn't bad. "Just let me know next time, so I don't think I'm being stalked," he said. Park nodded, promising to keep a respectful distance. Lingering threats. Days passed peacefully. No sign of lurking gang members. The orchard behind Keanu's house bore fruit in the late summer sun. He spent afternoons mending fences, throwing a ball for Ranger, and rereading favorite novels. Yet, every so often, when a car engine rumbled on the nearby road, or if a twig snapped unexpectedly at night, he felt that old adrenaline spike. The sheriff's patrols near his property increased. Mary, the neighbor who'd alerted the police, brought him homemade pie and asked if he felt safer. He assured her he was fine. In truth, he wasn't certain. The memory of that raid remained raw. An undercurrent of tension whispered that the cartel might strike again. A late-night call. Then, one night, as Keanu was drifting off in an armchair, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. He answered, half expecting a reporter or a misdial. Instead, a harsh voice with a Spanish accent spoke in clipped, ominous tones. "You got lucky once. Next time, you won't see us coming. We always pay our debts." The line went dead. Keanu's pulse thundered. He immediately phoned the sheriff, who tried to trace the call with little luck. "Could be a burner phone," Ballard said. "We'll keep watch. Stay vigilant." After that, Keanu realized his life might never fully return to the serene routine he once had. Threatening phone calls, cryptic notes, the feeling of being watched. This was the dark side of tangling with organized criminals. Yet he refused to abandon the farm. If the cartel wanted to come again, he'd be prepared. And maybe by then, law enforcement would close in on them first. A growing legend. In the public sphere, the story took on a life of its own. Fans on social media hailed Keanu as a real-life action hero. Memes circulated, referencing his famous roles and dramatizing the confrontation. Late-night talk show hosts milked it for laughs, quipping, "You don't raid John Wick's farm." Keanu, never one to bask in that kind of attention, avoided interviews. He issued a short statement through a publicist, thanking local law enforcement and asking for privacy. Hollywood insiders approached him with projects that mirrored the raid scenario. Producers pitched scripts about a heroic star defending his land. He politely declined. Exploiting a life-threatening event for profit felt wrong. He wanted no part in sensationalizing violence, healing, and determination. Weeks turned into a month, and the farmland gradually healed. Repaired barn doors, fresh paint covering bullet holes, and new plants replacing trampled sections of the yard. Hank finished reinforcing windows with ballistic film. Ranger trotted happily around the perimeter each morning, tail wagging. And David Park, the private investigator, made occasional appearances, always from a distance, scanning the area for suspicious activity. Yet beneath the surface calm lay a readiness, a quiet acceptance that danger could return. Keanu felt it each time the sun set. He practiced his martial arts drills in the barn, wanting to stay sharp. If another raid came, he intended to protect his home again, but this time with a deeper awareness of how brutal things could get. A lasting lesson. In a quiet conversation with Mary, Keanu confided that he sometimes felt guilt. "What if I'd just been an ordinary farmer?" he mused, sipping her sweet tea on her porch. "I might have been killed that night." Mary patted his hand gently. "But you weren't. And God knows how many families those thugs would have hurt next if they'd succeeded. Maybe you saved more lives than you realize." It was a perspective he hadn't considered. By standing his ground, he'd exposed the cartel's operations to local law enforcement. Several criminals were now off the streets. That alone, Mary suggested, was worth any personal inconvenience. Keanu nodded, humbled by the thought. Looking forward. The summer waned, drifting into a mild autumn. The orchard's leaves turned gold, and the air cooled in the evenings. The farm settled into a calmer rhythm. No more calls came from unknown voices. No suspicious cars lingered at the gate. Yet, Keanu remained prepared. He'd built a life here that was worth defending. A life of honest work, kindness, and simplicity. For the cartel, the shame of failing to raid a celebrity's farm still festered. Some might eventually try to exact revenge, but for the time being, the farm had become a red flag target. Not the easy pickings they'd presumed. Word had spread among criminal circles that messing with Reeves spelled disaster. And so, Keanu Reeves returned to something like normal, albeit a new normal with vigilance woven into every day. When he rose at dawn to feed the horses, he listened a moment longer for unusual sounds. When neighbors stopped by, he felt a surge of gratitude for their watchful care. When he read in the evenings, the thought lingered that a phone call or a footstep could bring everything crashing down again. But as the moon rose above the barn and Ranger lay at his feet on the porch, Keanu gazed into the starlit sky and let himself breathe in the hush of farmland. He remembered the roar of gunfire, the adrenaline, the need to survive, and realized that the deeper message was one of defiance. He had staked his claim to this quiet life, and no band of raiders would force him to give it up. Epilogue: Strength in Simplicity. Long after the media storm passed, the townsfolk continued telling the tale of that summer night. They spoke of how the Cartels' men sneaked in, only to be driven off by an actor who refused to abandon his home. They joked that if you wanted to find a real-life action hero, you wouldn't look on a Hollywood set, but on a dusty farm road in rural California, where the gentle ring of horse hooves met the unbreakable resolve of a man named Keanu Reeves. For his part, Keanu never boasted about that evening. He remained the same unassuming neighbor who lent a hand when someone's car broke down, the same quiet customer at the diner reading his book over breakfast. But everyone knew that beneath the calm veneer stood someone who understood that life is worth protecting. Someone who had faced a ruthless enemy under the moonlit sky and sent them packing. Someone who proved that behind those soft-spoken words and gentle demeanor lay a spirit that no cartel, however vicious, could easily break. And in the months to come, as he continued to live among the rolling hills and weathered barns, Keanu Reeves knew that if the cartel decided to come back, they'd be reminded of just how much they regretted attacking his farm the first time, and how much worse it would be if they tried again. Because, in that place of sunlit orchards and peaceful routine, he stood ready to defend the life he cherished, no matter the cost.